Have you ever noticed that the moment you finally decide to move on, they suddenly come back? Not loudly, not clearly, but quietly, in ways that confuse your mind more than your heart, a message that appears out of nowhere. A late night hey that feels small, but somehow shakes your entire emotional world, or a memory disguised as kindness, dropped at the exact moment you start feeling stronger without them. And the strange part is this: you were doing fine, you were starting to breathe again, you were finally getting your peace back. But now, everything feels uncertain again. One small signal, and suddenly your progress feels fragile. Your no contact starts to feel like a test you are about to fail. This is not random. This is a pattern, and understanding it is the first step to breaking free from it completely. There is a psychological trap that many people never see coming. It is not loud. It is not obvious. It does not feel like manipulation at first. It feels like hope. It feels like maybe things are changing. Maybe they finally understand. Maybe this time is different. But what if it is not about love at all? What if it is about control without effort? What if the connection you feel is not a sign of reunion, but a signal that your emotional system is being activated again? This is where the concept of avoidant hoovering begins to matter. It is what happens when someone who avoids emotional closeness suddenly reaches back in, not to fully reconnect, but to pull you emotionally back into their orbit. Not to rebuild, but to reappear just enough to keep access to you. And the most powerful part is how subtle it is. It rarely starts with a deep apology. It does not begin with responsibility or clarity. It begins with fragments. A memory, a casual message, a soft reminder of good times, something that feels harmless on the surface but carries emotional weight underneath. Because your mind does not process it logically first. It processes it emotionally. Human psychology is deeply wired to respond to familiarity. Even when something hurt you, your brain remembers the moments that felt warm, the moments that felt safe, the moments where hope existed. That is why emotional attachment does not break easily. It does not disappear just because logic says it should. So when that person returns in any form, your nervous system reacts before your reasoning does. You feel a shift, a pull, a tension between what you know and what you feel. And that internal conflict is exactly where people get stuck again. No contact is powerful because it interrupts this cycle. It creates distance between emotion and reaction. It allows your brain to reset from emotional dependency. But hoovering is designed to break that reset, not with force, but with familiarity. And that is why it works so well. You might tell yourself you are strong. You might believe you will not respond. But emotional patterns are not broken by intention alone. They are broken by consistency. And the moment something familiar appears, your emotional system starts to question everything again. Was it really that bad? Did they really mean harm? Maybe they have changed. Maybe I misunderstood everything. These thoughts do not come from truth. They come from emotional memory being activated. And emotional memory is powerful. It does not care about timelines or logic. It only responds to connection. That is why avoidant hoovering feels so confusing, because it does not feel like an attack. It feels like possibility. And possibility is one of the strongest emotional triggers a human can experience. It keeps hope alive even when reality has already given you answers. But here is the deeper truth most people only understand too late. When someone truly values your peace, they do not reappear in fragments. They do not reopen emotional doors they never intended to walk through properly. They do not restart cycles they never took responsibility for ending. Instead, they stay consistent. They show clarity. They build safety instead of confusion. And anything less than that is not stability. It is repetition of the same emotional loop that already hurt you once. This is why breaking no contact feels so hard. Not because you are weak, but because your mind is being pulled between healing and familiarity, between growth and emotional memory, between peace and the old pattern that once felt like love. And the truth is, the moment you start understanding this dynamic, something inside you begins to shift. You start seeing the pattern instead of just feeling it. You start recognizing the difference between genuine connection and emotional triggering. You begin to notice that what felt like love coming back was actually just a cycle trying to restart itself. But there is something important you need to stay with until the end of this journey. Because once you understand the full psychology behind hoovering, the emotional pull loses its power. And what once felt irresistible starts to feel predictable. and that is where real freedom begins. The real confusion begins when silence is suddenly interrupted by attention that feels small but emotionally heavy. It is not a grand return. It is not a clear apology. It is something far more subtle. A message that arrives without explanation. A reaction to something you posted. A memory brought up in a casual way. And because it feels light, the mind lowers its guard before the heart even realizes what is happening. This is where many people misread the situation. They assume that any form of return means growth. But in reality, not every return is a step forward. Some returns are only emotional reflexes. A way of checking whether access still exists, a way of testing whether the door is still unlocked, not to walk in fully, but to see if it can still open. Avoidant patterns are built around distance. Not always physical distance, but emotional distance. The need to feel connected without feeling exposed. So when they sense that you are truly stepping away, a different internal pressure appears. It is not always about missing you in a deep emotional sense. It is often about discomfort with loss of control over the emotional connection. And this is where hoovering becomes more intentional in behavior, even if it is not fully conscious in thought. It starts to take shape through indirect contact, something that does not demand commitment but still creates impact. A light touch on your emotional awareness, just enough to see if you still respond the same way. The human mind is extremely sensitive to unfinished emotional experiences. When something ends without closure, the brain continues to seek resolution. It looks for meaning. It replays past moments, trying to make sense of what was unclear. This is why even a small interaction can feel much bigger than it should. It activates unresolved emotional files that were never fully closed. And when that activation happens, clarity becomes harder to hold because the nervous system does not wait for logic. It reacts instantly. A single sign of attention can create a surge of old emotional pathways, the same ones that once held hope, attachment, and expectation. This is why many people feel thrown off balance again. It is not because they lost progress. It is because their emotional system was triggered by familiarity. And familiarity is one of the strongest psychological forces in human behavior. It often feels safe, even when it is connected to pain. In these moments, the mind starts negotiating with itself. It tries to reinterpret the past. It searches for softer explanations. It focuses on selective memories instead of the full picture. Not because the truth disappeared, but because emotional stimulation temporarily weakens emotional distance. This internal negotiation creates confusion. One part remembers the hurt. Another part remembers the bond. And when both parts are active at the same time, decision-making becomes unstable. That instability is exactly where repeated cycles begin. What makes avoidant hoovering so effective is that it does not demand a response. It invites one. It leaves space for interpretation. It gives just enough emotional material for the mind to build a story again. And humans naturally want to complete stories that feel unfinished. But there is a hidden cost to this pattern. Every time attention is reintroduced without real consistency, emotional healing slows down. Not because progress disappears, but because the emotional system is pulled back into processing mode. Instead of moving forward, the mind returns to analyzing, questioning, and hoping. This is how invisible loops form. Not through constant interaction, but through occasional disruption. Long silence followed by small contact creates a stronger emotional impact than steady communication, because unpredictability increases emotional engagement. The brain becomes more alert, more reactive, more invested in understanding what is happening. That is why these moments can feel overwhelming, not because they are meaningful, but because they are inconsistent. And inconsistency creates emotional tension. The mind tries to resolve that tension by assigning meaning to it, even when meaning is unclear. In this state, boundaries become harder to maintain. What once felt like certainty starts to feel negotiable. The decision to stay distant becomes emotionally questioned, not because it was wrong, but because it is being emotionally challenged again. And this is where awareness becomes essential, because without awareness, the pattern repeats itself quietly. A response is given, a conversation restarts. Old emotional roles return without being noticed, and suddenly, what was meant to be healing turns into re-entry into the same cycle. The most important thing to understand is that emotional influence does not always require effort. Sometimes it works through timing, through silence, through small gestures that appear harmless. but their effect is not in what they say. It is in what they awaken. And what they awaken is usually not new emotion. It is old emotion that was already in the process of fading. This is why distance is not just about avoiding contact. It is about protecting emotional clarity. Because clarity is fragile when triggered repeatedly. And without clarity, decisions are no longer based on reality. They are based on emotional reaction. When this pattern is seen clearly, something begins to change internally. The pull does not disappear immediately, but it loses some of its mystery. It becomes recognizable, predictable. And once something becomes predictable, it loses a part of its emotional control. That recognition is the beginning of breaking the cycle, not through resistance alone, but through understanding how the cycle operates beneath the surface. What makes this pattern even more powerful is how it slowly reshapes your perception of reality without you noticing it. At first, everything seems clear. You step away because something inside you finally understands that peace requires distance. But when subtle contact appears again, it does not just bring emotion back, it begins to rewrite interpretation. The mind has a natural tendency to assign meaning to behavior, especially when that behavior comes from someone who once held emotional importance. So even the smallest signal is not treated as random. It is treated as information that must be decoded. And once decoding begins, objectivity starts to fade. This is where distortion quietly enters. Not as a sudden change, but as a gradual shift in how events are viewed. What once looked like inconsistency begins to look like uncertainty. What once felt like emotional unavailability starts to feel like timing issues. The same actions begin to receive softer explanations, not because they changed, but because perception is being influenced by renewed emotional stimulation. Avoidant dynamics often depend on this shift in interpretation. Because when emotional distance is stable, the bond weakens naturally. But when that distance is interrupted periodically, the mind is forced to reevaluate. And reevaluation opens space for doubt. Doubt opens space for reconsideration. And reconsideration opens space for re-engagement. This cycle does not require persuasion. It only requires interruption. And interruption is enough to restart internal emotional dialogue that was already beginning to quiet down. One of the strongest psychological forces at play here is intermittent reinforcement. It is the same principle that makes unpredictability so gripping. When emotional signals are inconsistent, the brain becomes more engaged, not less, because it starts searching for patterns in randomness. It starts expecting meaning in timing. It starts attaching significance to moments that may not actually carry intention. This is why the emotional impact of rare contact is often stronger than consistent communication. Stability allows detachment, but unpredictability keeps attention alive. And attention is the foundation of emotional connection, even when it is unwanted. Over time, this creates a subtle shift in internal focus. Instead of continuing forward emotionally, part of awareness remains anchored in anticipation, waiting for another signal, monitoring behavior, interpreting silence. This divided attention weakens emotional recovery without making it obvious. And while all this is happening internally, external behavior may seem unchanged. Life continues. Routine continues. But inside, emotional processing is no longer fully detached. It is partially reactivated. And that partial reactivation is enough to slow down healing significantly. Another important layer is how memory becomes selective under emotional pressure. The mind does not store experiences evenly. It prioritizes emotionally intense moments. So when contact returns, even briefly, it can trigger a flood of highlighted memories that feel more meaningful than the overall reality of the connection. This creates an internal imbalance. The past is no longer seen as a complete picture. Instead, it is seen through emotionally bright fragments, moments of laughter, moments of closeness, moments that felt meaningful at the time. And these fragments begin to overshadow the broader pattern that originally led to separation. As this happens, reasoning becomes less dominant. Emotional recall becomes stronger. And when emotional recall is stronger, decisions are no longer based on the full timeline. They are based on selected emotional highlights. This is where people often begin to question their own choices. Not because the situation has changed, but because their internal reference point has shifted. What once felt like clarity now feels like uncertainty. What once felt final now feels revisitable. But beneath all of this, the original reasons for stepping away have not disappeared. they have only been temporarily obscured by renewed emotional activation. And that distinction is critical because activation does not equal transformation. It only means the system has been triggered again. When this triggering happens repeatedly, emotional resilience begins to weaken, not through dramatic breakdown, but through repeated re-entry into unresolved feelings. Each reactivation pulls attention away from forward movement and back into processing what was already being processed before. This is why distance without interruption is so important. It allows emotional systems to settle fully, it allows perception to stabilize, and it allows clarity to become the dominant state again. Without that stability, every new signal becomes a reset point rather than a step forward. The challenge is that the mind often mistakes emotional activation for emotional significance. It assumes that if something still creates a reaction, it must still matter in the same way it once did. But reaction is not proof of value. It is proof of sensitivity, and sensitivity decreases only through consistent absence of triggers. When triggers keep appearing, even in small forms, sensitivity remains active. And when sensitivity remains active, emotional separation remains incomplete. This is why progress can feel inconsistent, even after long periods of distance. Understanding this helps reframe the experience. It shifts the focus from emotional reaction to emotional pattern recognition. Instead of asking why the feeling returned, the deeper question becomes why the pattern was reactivated again. And that question leads to awareness instead of confusion. With awareness, the emotional pull begins to lose its illusion of unpredictability. It starts to appear structured, repetitive, recognizable, and once recognition replaces confusion, emotional influence naturally weakens. That is where real internal shift begins to form. When emotional clarity starts to fade under repeated triggers, something deeper begins to happen inside the mind. It is not just confusion about the other person, it becomes confusion about your own judgment. You begin to question what you already decided. You start wondering if your earlier conclusion was too harsh, too emotional, or incomplete. This self-doubt is not accidental. It is a natural response when emotional signals are inconsistent and difficult to interpret. Human thinking relies heavily on consistency to build certainty. When behavior follows a stable pattern, the brain quickly forms a clear understanding. But when behavior shifts between distance and reappearance, the mind struggles to form a stable conclusion. Instead of settling, it stays active, constantly updating its interpretation, and constant updating prevents emotional closure. This ongoing mental activity creates a subtle dependency on resolution. The mind begins to feel uncomfortable without answers, so it keeps searching. It replays past interactions. It re-examines tone, timing, and meaning. It tries to reconstruct intention from incomplete information, and in doing so, it becomes emotionally involved again, even without direct engagement. What makes this cycle powerful is that it feels like thinking, but it functions like attachment. The more attention is given to decoding behavior, the more emotional energy is invested in it. And once emotional energy is invested, detachment becomes harder to maintain. In situations involving avoidant patterns, this effect becomes stronger because clarity is rarely provided. Instead of direct communication, there is ambiguity, and ambiguity forces interpretation. The absence of clear meaning invites imagination to fill the gaps, but imagination is shaped by desire, memory, and emotional residue, not by objective truth. So what happens is a quiet distortion of internal narrative. Events that were once understood in a firm way begin to feel open to reinterpretation. The past becomes flexible. The meaning of distance becomes negotiable. Even the original decision to step away starts to feel less certain under this shifting mental lens. At the same time, emotional reactivation keeps reinforcing selective focus. The mind begins to highlight specific details while ignoring broader context. Small positive signals gain disproportionate weight. Neutral or negative experiences lose intensity in memory. This imbalance creates a skewed emotional picture that feels more hopeful than the full reality supports. And hope, once reawakened, is difficult to silence through reasoning alone. Because hope is not built on logic, it is built on possibility. And possibility always feels open, even when evidence suggests otherwise. This is why internal resistance alone is not enough to maintain distance when emotional triggers continue to appear. Another layer that strengthens this cycle is identity attachment. Over time, emotional connections can become tied to self-perception. The relationship is no longer just about another person. It becomes part of how you understand yourself in relation to closeness, care, and belonging. When that connection is disrupted, a sense of internal imbalance can appear. So when any signal of return is noticed, it does not only activate emotional memory, it also activates identity memory. It reconnects you with a version of yourself that existed inside that bond. And that reconnection can feel familiar, even comforting, despite the pain that was also present in that experience. This is where internal conflict becomes more intense. One part of awareness recognizes the need for distance. Another part feels drawn toward reconnection due to familiarity and identity association. And when both parts are active at the same time, emotional stability becomes difficult to maintain. What often goes unnoticed is how quickly emotional interpretation can shift under these conditions. A behavior that once felt unclear may start to feel meaningful again. A silence that once felt necessary may start to feel like misunderstanding. The same situation is not changing externally, but its meaning is changing internally. This internal shift is what keeps cycles alive, not direct persuasion, not confrontation, but reinterpretation. Each new emotional activation gives the mind another chance to revise its understanding, and with each revision, certainty becomes weaker. Over time, this can lead to a state where emotional boundaries feel less firm than they once were, not because they were abandoned intentionally, but because they were repeatedly challenged by subtle reactivation, and repeated challenge weakens psychological structure even when decisions remain logically intact. The danger here is not immediate action. It is gradual erosion of clarity, a slow shift from certainty to openness, from closure to reconsideration, from distance to emotional monitoring. And this shift often happens without clear awareness until the pattern has already restarted. Breaking this requires more than restraint. It requires recognition of how perception itself is being influenced. Because when perception is understood as flexible under emotional stimulation, it becomes easier to separate feeling from fact, reaction from reality, interpretation from truth. Once that separation becomes clearer, the emotional cycle loses some of its influence. Not instantly, but progressively. Because what once felt like meaningful uncertainty begins to reveal itself as predictable fluctuation. And in that recognition, the internal space needed for real emotional independence begins to form again.